Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video I'm finally getting around to doing my final juror ranking for Australian Survivor. Now this will only include the Network 10 series of Australian Survivor, and I'll be ranking all these final jurors based on how they played on the seasons that they were final jurors of, not based on how I feel about them as players in the grand scheme of Survivor. And with that, let's jump right into it. We got 7 players to rank here, so at number 7, the bottom placed final juror for me comes from Australian Survivor, Brains versus Brawn. We do have Flick. I mean, Flick is one of these people that gets voted out of the game and gets saved by a twist, which is for me one of the bigger flaws that you can have over the course of a singular game. But even beyond that, is rarely in the majority throughout the game. I mean, she is part of the original majority on the original Brawn tribe, being the swing vote during the Janelle and Gavin vote-offs. Seems to be kind of aloof on the Benny vote-off, where Big D causes a tie, and on the revote, she still decides to stay true, while Shannon and Kez end up flipping there. She's eventually on the bottom after Shannon is voted out, or she's the only person left on the outs there, but then she's able to rebound by siding with the Brains to blindside Simon, but then gets back together with the Brawn at the merge, only to continue to be blindsided over and over and over again. I mean, she gets blindsided when Kez goes home, and while she's kind of in the majority there, she's in the majority because like they're purposely putting votes onto Laura so that Haley can use the idol successfully on her. But either way, I mean, like, definitely gets outplayed during that round, loses one of her closest allies. Same thing with the eventual Gerald boot, where she even wastes her own idol on Emmett, only for Gerald, her other closest ally, to eventually go home. Has no clue what's going on during the Laura boot, though to be fair, almost no one did. Gets blindsided when Emmett goes home, being on the bottom, and remains on the bottom from that point forward, where really the power structure stays intact with the old Brains and Haley, George, Cara, and Way sticking together while they pick off Andrew, Flick, and Danny. But Flick breaks the correct urn and returns to the game, only for her to be greatly benefited by the fact that she has an idol at the Final 5 and also wins Final 4 immunity to even be able to get to Final 3 in a position where George actively plays the game in a way to not get Flick to the end by voting out Cara at 4 to lead to Haley winning Final immunity and voting Flick out. Again, like, it's a game where, like, Flick really has a little control throughout the entire game, also has the flaw of being voted out and coming back into the game. There's really not much positive I can really say about Flick's game as a whole, so for me, she is at the bottom here at number 7. Now, number 6, we're moving on to kind of a middling final juror to me, one that, like, I'm not like high or low on necessarily. And to be honest, it was a big debate between number 5s and 6 on this list, with the main reason this person is lower is because this person was more directly saved by a twist than the other person. So at number 6, we do have Peter from Australian Survivor 2017. And again, the main reason he is lower than the next person we'll be talking about is because, again, he was saved by a twist. There was a tribal where he was going to go home, but instead was given the chance to mutiny, which he eventually does, and that ends up saving him in the game. Where if that had not happened, he would have been voted out. Mind you, that situation to begin with was perpetuated by him being swap screwed, but at the same time, it's like he still had a decent amount of time at that point to try to work something out, and still was ineffective in doing so. But I mean, Peter's someone that, like, was in the majority for a lot of the game. I mean, early on, he votes correctly in voting out Adam, then Kate, eventually flips alongside AK to vote out Amy, and becomes part of AK's core group afterwards, where they vote out Tara and Annalise. And again, gets swap screwed, where he does get swapped onto a tribe alongside AK, where they're the only 2 of his alliance. And AK is just such an easy target to be taken out there, to where he is easy pickings immediately afterwards. But again, gets saved by mutiny, but then gets submerged, where he is once again on the bottom, where his closer allies and Jared and Annalise go out back to back, and eventually alongside Tessa are able to flip to take out Henry. But again, it didn't seem like he was super integral to that, and he was even one of the targets coming into that round, and proceeds to lose his closest ally in Tessa immediately afterwards, and proceeds to get saved by there just being bigger targets on the board over him moving forward, which, I mean, if he was doing this more actively, I would give him credit for that, but I do feel like this was just a circumstance how the game played out, where Sarah was looked at as a big threat for her constant flipping, Luke was looked at as a big threat, Ziggy was looked at as a big threat, Lockie was looked at as a big threat, and even there, I mean, Peter was the secondary target in the Lockie vote. He was probably someone that probably would have gone home at Final 4 or at least been very likely to had he not won immunity there, and eventually goes home at 3. So again, it's a rocky game. I mean, especially in the post-merge. I mean, pre-merge, he's pretty solidly positioned until the swap, and post-merge, he's kind of in and out with the majority. But again, he is also saved by the mutiny twist that, again, is a little bit of a knock to leave him below the next person we'll be talking about. So he's here at number 6. And number 5, moving on to a player that really, I think has more holes in his game than Peter, but again, doesn't have a point where he is directly saved by a twist. So at number 5, we do have Brian Lake from Champions vs. Contenders 1. And again, Brian is someone that had a very rocky early game. I mean, he's really on the bottom throughout the entire pre-merge section of the game, where he just never really bonded with his original champions group, to where, like, despite the fact that he does vote in the majority, I feel like he's mostly being kept around as a physical asset more so than because people actually like him or trust him. And we see that when we get to the merge, where him and Jackie are on the bottom and instantly get flipped on, but he's still able to skate his way to the merge, where at that point there's just bigger threats on the board, up until the Matt Rogers blindside, where he is finally getting targeted there, but obviously is able to pull together the votes to vote out Matt. Now, again, like, how much would you credit this to Benji? I think a lot of it, but I think beyond this vote, I think Brian plays pretty well to a degree. I mean, he is obviously the main instigator of the eventual Benji vote, where he does flip back alongside Monica to take out Benji, and then is the leader of taking out Steve for whatever reason. But again, he is kind of running the game at that point. But then he also kind of like sabotages his game at the final 6 by swapping his vote onto Sharn in order to save Shane, but through that also sends home one of his closest allies in Fenella and loses the trust of Shawnee, to where Shawnee ends up flipping on him to vote out Monica, where he's really only safe because he has an idol at that point. And he saved at 4 by winning immunity. And the fact that he couldn't even convince Sharn, this person who would have easily beaten him at the end, had he gotten to the end to take him to the end, is a pretty bad sign of him as a player, to be honest. And again, like, for me, him and Peter were very close. Peter was in the majority for more of the game, but I think Brian was more impressive while in the majority, and also wasn't directly saved by twist. So again, it really could go either way for me, but I did decide to go with Brian slightly higher, even though his win equity was also much lower than Peter's. So it's very close, but I did go with Brian here, number 5. Now, number 4, we're moving on to a player that I know gets constantly talked about as one of the best players of all time for Australian Survivor. And again, he is good, but I do feel like his game here is maybe a little bit overstated. And that person is Harry from Champions vs. Contenders 2. Harry is someone that really just doesn't go to tribal that much in the pre-merge. I mean, he does go to one tribal before the swap, and really that was more of a consensus boot where everyone's kind of on board with Laura going home and they just like split the vote, so whatever. But seemed to be kind of in the middle position on that original Contenders tribe, but really we just didn't see that much of them. But once we get to swap, he's obviously swapped into a pretty bad position where he's on the bottom. But in that position, he has to use 2 idols in a row to keep himself in the game, which, again, very wonky. He gets to merge where he's on the bottom. He loses his numbers in Andy and then Sean. And obviously there is this David blindside, but then continues to be on the bottom when John goes home, and then Daisy. But then he's able to flip the game at the final 7 and then plays pretty well from that point on. Again, final 7, flips the game on Simon. Simon comes back into the game, votes out Simon again, creates his core group with Baden and Abby to where they want to take out Luke, but Luke continues to win immunities. To where they take out Janine, and then he does get outplayed by Luke at the eventual Abby boot, but again, that was something that was perpetuated by one, Luke having immunity, and then also Luke having an advantage. And again, there was a lot of wonky stuff going on there, but he still remains control in the next vote, voting out Luke, and then is eventually voted out by Baden at the end, which I think you have the fault in for him not having Baden want to take him to the end. But again, it's kind of like Brian's game to me in how rocky it is and how many like holes there are, where again, like, he needs 2 idols in a row. Like, that's pretty bad. He doesn't have much control through the first half of the pre-merge. That's pretty mediocre. And even in the portions where he does have a decent amount of control, he is still being outplayed by Luke at points. But I mean, his win equity is so much higher than Brian's, where he for sure beats Baden, and he probably ends up being Pia as well. So like, for me, that's enough to put him above Brian, even though a lot of his game is still pretty rocky. But again, enough to land him here number 4. 4. Now, number 3, moving on to a game that was at least more consistent than all the ones we've talked about so far. I mean, to be honest, this game's still not the greatest in the world, but at least someone that was in the majority from at least the post-swap until the end of the game, and that is impressive in its own right. And that person is Moana from Australian Survivor All-Stars. Now, the biggest flaw here is that Moana was a massive jury goat, where Moana was probably not winning against anyone in the game. And that's obviously a massive issue here, kind of similar to the issue of Brian. But again, like, I just think she was more consistent in the game. I mean, pretty much from the swap on, she holds on to control and stays in the majority from that point forward. I mean, she does have a rocky early game where she's on the bottom alongside Matt Rogers, and they do survive those first few rounds, but once she gets to swap, her game does kick up a bit. Again, she is the leader of the 2 Phoebe votes back to back, is able to execute on those, is able to flip David onto her side and maintains the majority at that point, and really just runs the game from the merge on alongside David and Sharn and Tarzan, where they hold the numbers moving forward. And while obviously there are twists that do harm their positioning in the game, she's still in the know of most of what's going on. I mean, she knows what's going on during the Zach vote when David is like completely blindsided by that. At the final 8, I mean, she is in a tiebreaker between her and Jackie. But again, I think you have to credit her for having a strong bond with David to where David really goes out and saving her. Again, having immunity and giving his idol to Tarzan to guarantee he doesn't flip. And at that point, through the outside of game relationship that Sharn and Moana have, again, that keeps her safe in that round. And through that, again, holds the numbers moving forward. Votes out Shawnee. AK goes out during fire. Never in danger to Tarzan vote. Votes out Brooke. And I guess the biggest flaw that you have to give to her is the fact that she was a final juror to begin with, and the fact that, like, why did David vote her out over Sharn, who was probably someone that was slightly harder to beat. But, I mean, realistically, again, she's in control for a lot of this game. I think the one major difference to me over her and the next 2 people we'll be talking about is I think the next 2 people were more out in front than Moana was, where I think with Moana's game here, I think David was the person that was looked at as the person more out in front throughout a lot of the game, even though they were kind of running the game together, while the next 2 people were the people that were perceived to be out in front. So I would give a bit more credit to them. And also, again, win equity is a major thing here where Moana was never winning the game. So again, that leaves her here at number 3. Now number 2, moving on to a player who I thought was going to be number 1 before this latest season, considering I think this person probably played one of the more underrated games in the history of Australian Survivor. And with that, we're going to Australian Survivor 2016. We do have Elle. And again, Elle plays a pretty dominant game on this season. I mean, she's someone that isn't really well known for that, just because the fact that, like, the edit barely showed her. But she's someone that does maintain a lot of control across the season. Now, I will say that she didn't have many opportunities to demonstrate that control. And, like, that's maybe the issue with, like, her in comparison to the next person we'll be talking about. And to be honest, even against Moana, had Elle's win equity not been as high as it was in comparison to Moana, where, again, like, Elle was someone that, like, on her initial Aganoa tribe, she is part of the initial majority, voting out Dez and Evan, but it's like, she's not really, like, the main person in the majority. I mean, it does seem like Phoebe and Rowan are kind of outplaying Lee and Elle at that point in the game, where Elle and Lee are kind of in the background there. But again, still, Elle is very well positioned, and she never goes to tribal again until the merge, because she gets swapped into the really overpowered Snapu tribe. And through that, she's able to bond with Flick and Brooke, who bring along Sam and create the core of the power structure that run the game come into the merge, where they really just pagong everyone outside of that initial group until they get to 7. And really, that's kind of like, again, not necessarily an issue, but the thing that does put her below the next person we'll be talking about is that, again, her game doesn't really become super dominant until the 7. Where before that, she's, again, in a good position, but isn't really running the game. Again, there are people like Phoebe and Rowan early on that are more out in front, and then eventually Brooke and Flick become more out in front throughout the early merge portion of the game. But it's really the final 7 round where I think her game really kicks up, where Brooke and Elle finally have to turn against each other, and Elle is effective in flipping over Flick onto her side. Again, Flick voting out her closest ally to keep Elle in the game, and that's very impressive work there. And from that point on, Elle and Lee hold all the control for the rest of the game, especially through Lee having his relationship with Christy to where Christy isn't willing to flip. That allows Elle to hold control as they vote out Nat and Flick. The problem is that Elle gets into a Final 3 position against someone that isn't likely to take her to the end and doesn't end up taking her to the end, which is a massive flaw against Elle as well to me, where like I do think she should have tried to get Christy out probably at 4, try to take Flick to 3, as she probably ends up beating Flick anyway if she gets to the end with her. And also Flick is more likely to take Elle than Lee. Like, that's a minor complaint there. But again, her win equity is also very large, where the entire jury thought that Elle was the biggest threat to win the game after the Brooke vote out. And again, she comes very close to winning at that point. I mean, she's literally one competition away from winning in a Final 3 scenario where both herself, obviously, and Lee are taking her to the end to where she wins. She really just needs to make sure that Christy didn't win, which obviously that doesn't end up happening. But again, it is a solid game, a game where she wins if she gets to the end, a game where she's pretty dominant from Final 7 on, and she's in a good position throughout the entirety of the game. But again, like, isn't in direct control as much as the next person we'll be talking about, which is the main reason why she's left here at number 2. And now number 1, the number 1 final juror for Australian Survivor is from the most recent season of the show, and that person is Josh. And this is kind of a weird one because this is actually the only final juror that isn't a third placer at this point. So technically this person did not make it as far as all the other final jurors, yet is above them because, again, I do feel like he was the most dominant figure of these final jurors. He's one of the few people really in the history of Australian Survivor to be able to run the game from beginning to end. Now, similar to Elle, I don't think he is able to demonstrate his control until a little bit later into the game. Again, like very early on, again, when Andy goes home, he's actually not voting for Andy. And then Brianna goes home. He's not really out in front at that point. Sandra goes home. He's not out in front. But it's really the Amy vote where he starts to become a lot prominent in the edit. But also, like, within the gameplay, you can tell how much of an influence he has at that point, where Amy's trying to flip the game on Jordan, and Josh's numbers seem to hold the control there in keeping Shay and Nina in line, alongside his already built alliance with Jordy and Mark. That's able to hold control until the merge, and then at the merge, again, he builds his new alliance with Mark, Sam, and Jordan, alongside Chrissy and David. That's able to essentially just run the table until Purgatory, where once Purgatory happens, 3 people come back into the game, and at that point, his game goes off the rails, but even then, he's somehow able to avoid being in danger. And while he does lose his loved one in Jordan in a tribal that, again, like, is perpetuated by both Purgatory and then also KJ essentially being handed an advantage, at that point he's still the swing vote during the Sam vote off. He is the main one in charge of the David vote off, where he's the one to want to keep Mark and Jordy around to get rid of David, leads the charge against Jordy and eventually KJ. And again, like, I do think there are some failings in his last couple rounds, particularly around how he's not able to keep Chrissy in line. But again, considering how dominant he had been up until that point, it's still a really impressive game. I mean, it's a game where, again, like, he's really in the majority throughout the entire game and really demonstrates his control from the post-swap on, in a position where a lot of people look to him as the front runner. Now, I think in comparison to Elle, where I think Elle beats everybody, I think with Josh, it's not necessarily guaranteed that he beats everybody, where I think him against Jordy would have been close. I think him against Mark would have definitely gotten votes. Like, it definitely would have been a battle there. But again, I just think in comparison to Elle, where, again, like, Elle really doesn't have full control until the end game, in comparison to Moana, who probably had control for a similar amount of the game as Josh, I do feel like Josh was more out in front, while also had a lot more win equity than Moana. So again, like, for me, I do feel like Josh is the best final juror at this point, and to be honest, quite possibly the best non-winning game of Australian Survivor up to this point. So again, for me, he lands here at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my ranking of all the final jurors in Australian Survivor, at least the Network 10 series. Now, moving forward, I would like to do a more general international Survivor version of this list, where I mix the SA and the Australian list and then add in all these other random international seasons as well. So you can stay tuned for that at some point down the road. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.